Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Hey, John, how's it going?
Fine, Matt. Great to see you.
Yeah, I'm glad we finally have this conversation. I think about your book, The Power of Bad, all the time now because I'm trying to understand the crazy world we live in the media and social media, and I had the occasion to re-listen to a podcast you did. I suspect days before the world started shutting down in response to the pandemic, and it was interesting because you were talking about trade-offs and risk and why people and particularly the press focus on the bad instead of thinking more rationally about trade-offs, and I wonder what your assessment is now 3.5 years later. Um, did we all just go crazy?
Yeah, I mean, that book, The Power of Bad, was published, I think, in January of 2020, and we had this chapter in it called "The Crisis," about this whole crisis industry that exists of academics and journalists and activists and politicians and bureaucrats. And the three rules we had for the crisis were uh, the world will always be in crisis. The crisis is never as bad as it sounds, and the solution could easily make things worse. And I've been debunking crises for decades now, but COVID, I was still just astonished at how bad things got in COVID, at how this crisis industry is just completely out of control and just did unprecedented damage. I mean, I never dreamed that you'd be able to scare people into shutting down society, depriving kids of school, ordering people to stop going to church. I mean, it's unbelievable that this happened, and yet, that's where we are now. This crisis industry has just, and now they've emboldened, and they're talking about, well, COVID. Our response to COVID was a blueprint for how we deal with climate change, and
Yeah.
that'll be the never-ending crisis. Every time there's a hot day somewhere, it's one more excuse to restrict people's freedom. It's just astonishing, I think, and I really I mean, I was astonished at how awful the media was. I mean, the mainstream media became absolutely worthless during COVID, as far as, they were only interested in doing panic porn. We're just going to give you this daily count of the deaths and this, and put nothing in perspective, completely overlook any sort of cost benefit analysis. I mean, COVID was a real problem, but um, the best. But we would have been better off, I think, without the CDC and during COVID. I mean, they did so much damage. If only we had done what Sweden did. If only there'd been more governors like Ron DeSantis who just ignored the CDC. Our society and our children would have been so much better off.
One of the collateral damages of all of that hysteria, and particularly the behavior of the CDC and public health officials generally, is devastating to the reputation of science itself. And they claim to be the science, but in truth, all of the noble lies and all of the flip flopping and all of the authoritarianism, I think, has sort of rightfully made people like me, who I would have absolutely called myself pro science, almost have a blind faith in this process of smart people trying to figure out how the world actually works. And now I'm skeptical of everything because I've come to realize that science itself has been corrupted by being intertwined with government, with all of its perverse incentives and inclinations to control our lives.
Exactly. I mean, I've been covering science for most of my career, and again, I was, and I've gotten skeptical. I did a piece for City Journal a few years ago called "The Corruption of Public Health," and it was evident then that that was one of the worst areas where progressives had just taken over public health, and their definition of public health, was basically, what can we do to expand the government's control over things? What can the government do more? And so they, the public health, the main professional association, at their annual meeting, they'd be passing resolutions about the minimum wage, about, all these progressive causes. And suddenly there were epidemics of gun violence and all these epidemics that weren't really what the CDC and the public health establishment was founded to do, but they were looking for any excuse to expand the government control. And then, but even having written all that and seeing how bad this movement had been taken over by the left, I was still stunned. I mean, before COVID, the world's leading experts on infectious diseases and on pandemics had drawn up plans at the CDC, in Canada, the UK, Sweden. These countries had drawn, and they had reviewed all the evidence. They looked back and they were planning for something as bad or worse than the Spanish flu epidemic of the early 20th century. And they all recommended, you don't lock down, you don't mask the public, there's no evidence this stuff works, and the collateral damage will be enormous. And yet, and that was what, even Fauci at the start said, I can't imagine America locking down. And no, there's no, he advised a colleague, don't wear a mask on a plane. There's no evidence it works. And then suddenly it just all flipped around that China knows what's going on and we'll do whatever China does, as if that's a great role model for us. And it was just astonishing how the science got suddenly completely reversed. And it wasn't really, and it was the CDC, it was the mainstream media that was just slavishly parroting that and trying to censor anyone who disagreed. And it was also scientific journals where suddenly, they fell into line and they wouldn't publish pieces that contradicted the narrative, that social media platforms, of course, were doing it. It was just astonishing. And so it's really very hard to put I don't really put any faith in the CDC or the public health establishment anymore. And what's worse, 3 years later, is there's been so little sense of, gee, we made a mistake and maybe we should do better next time. I mean, the CDC's director went to Congress and said, yes, we did make mistakes. We didn't do enough. And we need authority to do even more next time. It's just astonishing. And I did a piece for City Journal wondering, how do you fix this? How do you make sure we don't repeat this? And it's really, it's hard to imagine, because the traditional method for dealing with something like this is, after the Challenger disaster, after 9/11, you appoint a blue ribbon commission to examine it and say what went wrong, what went right, what do we do next time. But who would we appoint to this? Who would be trusted? The whole public health and science establishment was in on this. Now, there were some great scientists speaking out, but they would be obvious ones to investigate. But now it's become so polarized, and the establishment has been so corrupted and is so reluctant to admit their mistakes that they would probably just be written off as, oh, they're these conservative crazies, because they didn't buy into the lies that we were propagating.
It strikes me, you talk about the crisis industry, and I'll call it the crisis industrial complex, because it's a great overlay of government agencies and nonprofits and the media, all who at least think they're profiting from creating mass hysteria. And to me, it's probably as it doesn't tell us how to fix it, perhaps, but it's probably as simple as a public choice story of bootleggers and Baptists. Like, everybody's going to make more money. The more crises there are, they're going to grow their budgets, they're going to grow their prestige. And conversely, if you question the official narrative, you will be destroyed. And that was different, I think, than even back when you were writing for the New York Times. It strikes me that the cancellation or almost elimination of anybody questioning the official lockdown narrative was swift and brutal.
Right. It's really, it was swift and brutal. And you're absolutely right about the incentives. It's one of the problems. I've been thinking about expanding that chapter, the crisis, into a book. And there are, tons of examples. You see it every day as something that's being hyped. and and the solution making things worse. That fossil fuels, we have to eliminate cars now, and all the problems that's going to cause. I mean, you see it every day, and what has given me pause is that it's really hard to come up with a solution because the incentives, there's money to be made by getting more clicks, because of the power of bad, the negativity effect. People click on stuff that's, that scares them. That's the way you get a mass audience. I mean, the good news is that, shows like yours, social media, there are all these new platforms that appeal, that don't have to get an absolute, mass audience of the whole country, and they can appeal to people's better qualities instead of just scaring them. But, in the mass media, there's always this incentive to scare people. There's always an incentive for bureaucrats to get bigger budgets, and you don't get budgets by saying something isn't a problem. And that's how scientists get funding too. We have to solve this crisis, and there's kind of a niche market for some of us. I mean, I write articles and books, and there are other debunkers around, and the web is great, and that there is now this lively market for debunking in a sense. During the lockdowns, Toby Young, the journalist in London, started the Lockdown Skeptic. That's now the Daily Skeptic, and they do great work, and like, as you do in debunking this stuff. But it's so hard to get. It's hard to found huge institutions based on that. There just isn't the money to be made in not scaring people.
At Kibbe on Liberty, freedom is a lifestyle 24/7, something you live and breathe and wear every day. If that describes you, you need the very best Liberty swag in the market today, just like this shirt I happen to be wearing. Go to freethepeople.org/KOL and check out our exciting merch. You too can love liberty and look cool. Yeah, I'm in the process. I'm working on a documentary with Senator Rand Paul, trying to get to the roots of specifically the cover-up, because I think it's interesting to figure out why those incentives were so misaligned. And just from my personal experience, when I was a young economist, I worked on Capitol Hill when the Republicans took over in 1994, and I remember Newt Gingrich sort of slavishly worshiping science and wanting to radically expand government investment in basic science, which Republicans did with the Clinton administration. And then after 9/11, I think that's probably when Fauci consolidated his budget and his power under the supposed threat of bioterrorism. And so I think the answer, the problem was the centralization, de facto centralization of science funding through the government, because even if the government wasn't writing the check directly, the imprimatur of that probably dictated all private funds. So the solution, and I don't know how to pull this off, but the solution has to be a very, very clear separation of science and state, because the centralization and those perverse incentives are how we got here. But I don't know how to unwind it now that it's such a powerful beast.
Yeah, I mean, I wish you luck. I'd love to see what you find out, because it's so hard to unwind. And besides the government and this whole bioterrorism complex and doing that, you have like the Gates Foundation, which was, even worse. And, Bill Gates did that book, How to Prevent the Next Pandemic. And I love the Daily Skeptic had a headline, we must find a way to prevent Bill Gates from preventing the next pandemic.
Yes.
Michael Bloomberg funds a lot of the awful stuff in public health, the whole war on vaping, one of the great public health advances of the last century, getting all these people to quit smoking. But the danger was that, for the anti-tobacco activists, suddenly nobody's smoking. They need a new cause. So they pick on vaping. And it's just, it's just a class. That's the bootleggers and Baptists and the March of Dimes syndrome. I'm doing a piece for City Journal on that, about how, the way the March of Dimes, once polio was conquered, they had to invent a new cause for themselves. They didn't go out of business. And that's true with all these movements, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-tobacco movement. These activists need a job. And so they've got to keep finding new things to scare people about.
And speaking of scaring people, and you write about this in your book, and you pretty much write about it all the time, the culpability of the mainstream media just going from one crisis to another. I suspect a lot of my viewers know your story, your journey from the New York Times to the City Journal and being an independent investigative journalist. But if you could remind people of your you were one of them. There was blood on your hands.
Yeah, I was a lone skeptic at the New York Times. Well, there were a couple of us, but back then. But I started out in newspapers after college, and then various newspapers. Then I wrote for science magazines in the 1980s, and then I joined the Times in 1990, and I covered Metro stuff for a while. I did some foreign stuff. I wrote an op-ed column. I wrote a column called The Big City about New York, and then I wrote, for about 7 years, I wrote a science column. And the science section was, at that time was quite good. It had really data-driven reporters who did pay attention to the numbers. And unfortunately, I think throughout the mainstream media, there's been just a loss of that sort of dedication to data, and that there's partly I think it's the web, the pressure for clicks. Partly there's a new generation of journalists who have just grown up and have been indoctrinated in college and in high school and college, and are into the woke religion, and just sort of see journalism as their duty to advance that. So it's it's sad to see. I mean, the good thing is there are voices like yours, and there are lots of other new voices on the web, and people are turning to them more and more.
It is bizarre, and I know you've talked about this quite a bit. It's bizarre to see very serious reporters with seemingly no interest in defending free speech and the First Amendment, and I'm old enough to remember when that was the sacred thing that we all agreed on, even regardless of where we were coming from politically or philosophically. That America very much believed in a free press and free speech on campus and all that stuff, and I'm thinking how far we've come. You tweeted about this, but current news: David Portnoy, the sports guy, exposed a Washington Post reporter who was directly threatening and intimidating companies to pull out of his charity pizza event. That's new behavior, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, I did a piece, I think, in 2019 for City Journal, because it was an amazing trend to me. And the piece was headlined "Journalists Against Free Speech." And as you say, it used to be that, left, right journalists did at least agree on the First Amendment, that our jobs depend on it. And Nat Hentoff was the classic. He was, very left wing, but he wrote books. He wrote books defending free speech. He defended Nazis and the Klan's right to have a parade and do free speech. And it started. I mean, it's been changing. In talking to Greg Lukianoff at Firework, the great group that's been defending free speech on campus and elsewhere. He dated to around 2012, 2013, when Ray Kelly was shouted down at Brown University. And Greg said there had been these things before where activists had done it. Of course, there was stuff back in the 60s and 70s where, the IQ researchers needed police protection. They were shouting people down. But even, but the original Berkeley free speech movement, they supported the right of conservatives to speak. They were all they actually meant it when they said free speech, even though they were left wing. But when that happened at Brown, suddenly, the administration, people were not speaking up for free speech. They were actually defending the protesters. And I was stunned to see, some of the more recent ones, and when there were Milos Yiannopoulos, and who else was it that got shouted down? That was
Ben Shapiro certainly did.
Yeah. But I was amazed to see the college newspapers. Oh, when at Middlebury College, it was it Charles Murray there?
Yeah, it was Charles Murray. Yeah.
Right. My memory's a little rusty on that. But in both those cases, I think at Berkeley, And at Middlebury, the college papers, did not editorialize in favor of free speech. They actually, Berkeley criticized them. The Indianapolis he did not belong here. He shouldn't have been invited. And the Middlebury paper, they usually run editorials, but they suspended their editorial for that issue because they just couldn't really take a stand on whether physically assaulting a professor and a speaker were wrong or not. So they invited guest opinion writers in, most of whom basically sided with the protesters. And this thing, as you say, with the Washington Post, I also wrote about this trend of deplatforming people and trying to demonetize them the way they were doing to David Portnoy, where the Huffington Post would do this. They would start reaching out, as they would put in their stories, to advertisers of right-wing commentators and say, gee, this person is a horrible person who's a sexist, a racist, a homophobe, whatever, and reaching out to do it. And I asked the editor of the Huffington Post, well, how would you feel if people did this to you? And no, I couldn't get a straight answer at all. In fact, when someone did suggest that there was one conservative group that was trying to organize some advertising boycotts, the way that Sleeping Giants, this left-wing group, has a whole industry of digging up, information on, taking bad quotes out of context of conservatives and going out and then trying to boycott Tucker Carlson, Fox News, other places. And someone on the right was trying to do this with very little success. And the editor of the HuffPost, Lydia Polgren, said, "Oh, this is a real threat to journalism." But that's what her own journalists are doing,
Yeah.
And this is what. And I was, I'm not sure how much the Washington Post had done this before, but the thing with Portnoy was really going after his advertisers and saying he's problematic, he's this, and and claiming there was a backlash. I think one of the funniest lines in that piece was the supposed movement against Portnoy's businesses, these pizzerias, was led by a mathematician in Minnesota who the Post described with a straight face as the conscience of the food industry. A mathematician in Minnesota. It was a completely manufactured backlash by the journalists just trying to silence someone else. And
Yeah.
And I just find it amazing. Journalists are trying to put other journalists out of business. At least there used to be a consensus that, we're all in this industry. We need the First Amendment. Let's allow free speech. But now they've just gone really authoritarian.
Thank you for joining me today on Kibbe on Liberty and for being part of our fiercely independent audience. Every week, my organization, Free the People, partners with Blaze TV to bring you this show. My guests bring smart perspectives on everything from current events to timeless philosophical debates. If you like what you hear, go to freethepeople.org/KOL and support Kibbe on Liberty so we can continue to produce these honest conversations with interesting people. Now, let's get back to it. I'm trying to think if it was the Huffington Post or Vice, something like that has now started writing hit pieces on Rumble for refusing the British government's insistence on deplatforming Russell Brand. So it's the whole industry is like corrupted by this cancel culture stuff.
Yeah, there was something called the Vox. It was called the Vox ad apocalypse or something like that, where there was a guy at Vox whose name escapes me at the moment, was this horrible left-wing activist. So I think it left finally. But just, he was defending Antifa protesters and, the violence by them. And you had that, various outlets defending, violence by left-wingers, trying to shut down right-wingers. And they went after a bunch of advertisers for, I'm blanking on who it was now, but they, and HuffPost proudly, there was a thing called the Return of Kings. It was a right-wing website kind of, about sort of men's rights and looking at men. And they proudly that they managed to get it demonetized and get it shut down. And, what a great achievement for journalists to do that. I don't know. It's just, I'm just astonished the people that editors keep hiring them, because there still are some older adults who remember the old days, but I think they're so terrified of their staffs that they keep hiring these people and letting them run the newsroom.
Yeah, they seem captured right now, and at some point maybe business dictates that they come around, because surely they've noticed that not just Russell Brand, but certainly Joe Rogan and hundreds of other successful alternative media types are completely eating their lunch, with more thoughtful, exploratory, conversational style journalism that I think particularly young people find refreshing. So I see, I'm a short-term pessimist, always, and a long-term optimist, and I see that trend. But before we get too positive about things, and you're talking about cancellation, it seems like a great place to jump off to your latest piece in the City Journal, that misogyny is a myth, if I got the title right. The misogyny myth. Are you even allowed to suggest such a thing?
Well, City Journal is pretty brave. The reaction kind of was, well, we've upset people about everything else. Why not feminism too? But it's this, the whole idea that we're a misogynist society and that women are being held back. I mean, if you actually look at the research into it, it's just an utter myth. It's based on, I write about science a lot, and there's been this long-running thing that the women are being held back in science. The National Science Foundation has spent, $300 or $400 million, on this program to enhance equity in science, and it's just frequently declared in science journals, in editorials, or by the National Science Foundation, the National Academy of Sciences, that we have to combat, the discrimination against women. And this is based on, there were a couple of, studies, very small studies in the 1990s that purported to find a bias against women. And I go through some of the details of my piece, and they just simply were wrong. I mean, they were, terribly flawed. They didn't show what they did, and what they claimed to show. And then since then, there has just been a massive thousands of studies looking for bias against women scientists. And a big study was published earlier this year that reviewed all these studies. And it was done as part of an adversarial collaboration, which means you get researchers who disagree on a topic. They agree to work together. We'll go through the literature and we'll see what we can agree on. And in this case, they went through it all. And there was an economist, female economist, who'd been critical about bias against female economists. And she worked with researchers at Cornell who had done these huge studies, looking at bias in women. And what they found was that since 2000, there has not been bias against women in science in terms of getting papers published, in terms of getting grants, which have been the claims all along. And then when it comes to being hired and getting tenure, women are preferred over men. They do better than men with comparable, credentials. The National Academy of Science, it's much easier for women to get into that. The men who get in typically, I think, have 3 times more, publications and citations than the women. So it's, the story is completely the reverse, that there's a discrimination in favor of women. Now that's just in science, and the piece is, and you see this in all of society. I mean, it's just obvious in popular culture. You go on Oprah and you blame men for any problem, and the audience applauds. Our society is really misandrous. We're guilty of bias against men. You can blame any problem on toxic masculinity and testosterone poisoning, but who would dare talk about estrogen poisoning or toxic femininity? In the movie Barbie, they love talking about the patriarchy running society. And if the patriarchy really did, you wouldn't have movies like Barbie, be number 1 at the box office, which is, just shows men as buffoons and violent idiots, who really ought to step aside and let women run the world. If the patriarchy really did rule society, the stock father character in sitcoms, and commercials would not be a doofus dad. It's always women correcting their husbands who don't know what they're doing. So but there is, again, it's what we were talking about, these crisis industrial complexes where, feminism it's got a claim that there's discrimination. There's a whole diversity industry or diversity industrial complex that gets money, that gets favoritism, that survives by pretending that there's bias against women and finding new ways to discriminate against men.
If you've made it this far into the show, it means I must be doing something right. Kibbe on Liberty is just one of the amazing products we create at Free the People. We tell emotionally compelling stories and produce educational videos for the liberty curious. Our award-winning documentaries personalize all things liberty, independence, creativity, hard work, integrity, and perseverance. After the show, check out our work at freethepeople.org. And if you like what you see, donate to support what we do. That's freethepeople.org. Now back to the show. It strikes me that this industry that's constantly doing this and pitting the sexes against each other, it's creating a lot of destruction. And I know you briefly mentioned Warren Farrell in your article, and he most recently, I believe, wrote a book called The Boy Crisis. And I've talked to him before, and he was I forget the categories now, but he was a feminist in the 60s and 70s, and I would sort of identify with him as that type of feminist, because I sort of believe in strong women having choices and doing whatever they choose with their lives, which apparently is not feminism anymore. But he's talked about the destructive nature of this sort of anti-man attitude, and how it's damaging our boys, and it's damaging families, and it's damaging fatherhood. And it strikes me that this is not a costless demonization of men that's going on.
Oh, it's very costly. And your point about Warren, I mean, he's done great work on that, and he was one of the first to really do this. Christina Huff Summers did a book on the war against boys a while ago too, but he was great. I remember that I heard him talking at one point, and he said that when he was a male feminist, and as you say, in the 60s and 70s, and his book sold well. He was giving lectures, invited to give lectures all the time, was making a very good living at it. And then he started looking around and realized, wait a minute, boys and men are trailing in school. Men are committing suicide more. Men, there are all these bad things happening to men that we're not paying attention to. And so he made this transition to start worrying about that. And he said, suddenly he did that knowing that the people who buy these books are women. It's a female market, that he wasn't going to get the lecture fees anymore. It was a big financial sacrifice for him to do it, I think, because there's a market for telling women that they're oppressed and giving them special favors. And as you say, it is very costly to both. And most of us, and I sum up the latest evidence in this piece in City Journal, the Misogyny Myth, and I think it's a pretty good compendium showing you all the ways that things are stacked against men now. And I also know Warren's work, and there's been a bunch of other books on this, pointing this out, and they just get very little attention. And those of us who point out this myth of misogyny, we tend to end up. The problem is that men nobody really cares about men's welfare very much, including men themselves. I mean, men don't get ahead by complaining. They're just feeling I'll just go ahead and figure out a way I'll start my own business instead of trying to work my way up a corporation that is not going to promote me because I'm male. And so that there isn't a great market of people caring about that. And so what we end up trying to say is, well, look, it's bad for women too. I mean, that's how you get attention. And the Me Too movement has been really bad for women, and that because these false there have been false accusations that have ruined men's careers, and it's made men very very leery. And so now the diversity industry complains, and there are surveys showing this. They complain that a lot of men, managers and employees, don't want to meet with female colleagues alone because they're afraid of getting Me Too. And in the diversity industry is, gee, this is horrible that men are doing this. They should just man up and step up and go ahead. And yet these are real risks you face. If there's somebody who doesn't like you at work, they suddenly have this enormous cudgel they can beat you with. And the whole believe all women thing, that if you're accused of something, we're supposed to, as in the Russell Brand case, we're supposed to automatically believe the accuser and judge the man guilty, demonetize them on YouTube and do this. So men have become very leery to meet with women alone, and this hurts women. because obviously that they benefit from these meetings, and they also benefit from male mentors. There's since one of the justifications for favoring women in promotions, you promote them even if they're not the most qualified candidate, is that they will help other women fight against the patriarchy. The women will support each other. We need to get more women in executive positions to help other women. And but is that true? And there have been a couple of interesting studies. There was one that looked at scientists, and it's senior male and female scientists who mentor junior scientists, and they found that the junior female scientists who published papers with male mentors did better than the ones who published papers with female mentors. And they looked at like 3 million mentor-protege relationships. And the reaction to this was there was so much outrage among female senior scientists that that the journal pressured on this ridiculously flimsy, cynical pretext to withdraw the paper on this methodological nitpick that had never been applied to other papers that had politically acceptable conclusions. And so, these junior scientists who wrote the paper, the lead author was a junior female scientist, they had to apologize, and they said, well, we still think the findings are valid, but we're sorry we caused pain to female scientists on an individual level. So that shows you. And then the other example about the Me Too movement that I cite is that after Me Too, there's been a decline among collaborations between male and female economists, between especially the ones, the junior economists at universities who are looking for tenure. And so this decline has hurt the junior female economists because they did not compensate. They're doing fewer papers with male colleagues, and they haven't compensated by doing more papers with female colleagues. And so, whereas the male junior economists, they just compensated. They started doing more work with other men because they couldn't be Me Too'd by other men. And so there was this perverse thing that happened where female junior economists were getting tenure at a lower rate. Their chance of getting tenure went down because they weren't publishing as much because men were afraid to work with them. So that's, one example of how, this just poisons relations between the sexes. It's, so many marriages began as office romances, but now, now, and women still want men to make the first move in courtship. There's, I cite research data from Match.com and Singles in America and these surveys. Women want men to make the first move, but now you can be reported to, the HR department for subjecting a colleague to unwanted attention. So, this myth of misogyny, this attempt to portray men as oppressing women and women as victims, it creates jobs for the HR people and the diversity industry, but it really is poisoning relations between the sexes, and it's demoralizing and demeaning both sexes. I mean, you're penalizing hardworking men who don't get adequately rewarded for their achievements. They don't get the promotions, the awards, and you're telling women, you're discouraging women by telling them, oh, you're going to face so much discrimination, and basically encouraging them to wallow in this imagined victimhood. So it's enormously costly to both sexes.
It's particularly frustrating to me as someone. My wife Tierney and I will sometimes give talks together, and sort of half jokingly, I describe myself as a radical feminist, and she describes herself as an anti-feminist, and we actually mean exactly the same thing. So in a lot of ways, we're sort of destroying what should be a celebration of liberation for women, where they do absolutely. Modern society, modern capitalism has liberated them from roles that they might have felt locked into generations ago. And I'm thinking maybe you've read this book. My old friend Steve Horowitz wrote a book called Hayek's Modern Family, where he basically argues that it is capitalism that destroyed the patriarchy. I don't know if he uses that word. Maybe that wasn't a buzzword at the time. And that, because of growing prosperity, the traditional family roles where the the husband went out and killed something for dinner, and the wife raised the kids, that was an economic necessity to live that way. And as we got wealthier and wealthier, we were able to make more choices because the imperative to survive the night, the week, the winter was no longer the only thing that mattered. And so in one way, we're victims of our own success because we've liberated everybody to make choices about their careers and their families and everything else. And now we're just tearing us apart with this BS political crisis that you were just talking about.
Yeah, that's great. And I've not seen that book, but I will look for it now. No, I mean, if you go back, what I point out in the Misogyny Myth is that, we all owe all these opportunities and that both sexes have now are really, they're due to this a revolution since the Enlightenment. And that was really created by meritocracy, that until the 18th century, you had some isolated meritocracies, but you basically had these aristocracies, these stagnant aristocracies where male nobles were given special privileges and no one else could compete with them. And, they got the rewards and they ran society. And then, when that got upended, when at first it was mainly male commoners got a chance to compete, that just transformed the world. And, we had ideas of freedom, new ideas of government, science, the whole Industrial Revolution. We had new industries. It just transformed the world, and it made us so much richer. And it was that liberated women from their roles. That it was, that it was new industries and inventions. Textile mills. Suddenly women didn't have to spend their days, making clothes. There were new food processing industries, so you didn't have to spend all day cooking. There were washing machines. All these technological advancements that were mostly made by men, but they liberated women. And the most, we always hear about gender gaps and there's so many gender gaps that don't favor men. But we hear about the gender pay gap, and we hear about, there's a gender gap in the C-suite. But the most important gender gap at all is the longevity gap. Who actually gets to live longer? And before the Industrial Revolution, before we had the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, men lived longer than women. And that gap reversed, thanks to modern medicine, modern public health and other forces. And so women now live much longer than men, and they also get a bigger share of funding, of federal funding for medical research. So women, benefited enormously from all those male commoners, from that meritocratic competition in the 18th and 19th centuries that transformed the world. And then, that's what liberated women in the 20th century. Out and they could, and there had been a myth perpetrated by the old male aristocracy, and to some extent that lasted into the 18th and 19th centuries, that women were too fragile, they were too intellectually limited to succeed in the public sphere. But it was men, it was all these male inventions and industries that liberated women to go out and work in the public sphere, and they shattered that myth. They showed that they could compete, that they could do that. And so now that everyone is so much richer, so much freer, has so many more opportunities than ever, we're now reverting back to this old, we're getting rid of meritocracy and getting back to another old spoil system, except instead of male aristocrats being the beneficiaries, it's now, the diversity industry that is now awarding jobs according to your membership in a group. And, meritocracy, Adrian Woolvers did this great book called The Aristocracy of Talent, and he argues very persuasively that it was meritocracy that made the modern world. That the idea that your success, you should be able to succeed according to your individual abilities and accomplishments, not your membership in a group. That's what remade the modern world. And now we're abandoning that because it all depends on what group and which identity group you belong to. Those are the people who get rewarded.
Okay, if we haven't been canceled yet, we have to talk about something even more controversial, the perhaps the central religious symbol of the pandemic industrial complex, the mask. And you wrote a piece fairly recently, "No masks, please. We're rational." And it's so straightforward and so obvious to me. And I'll start with the story. about 20 years ago, I survived stage 4 cancer. And anybody that's ever been through that knows that chemotherapy eventually completely destroys your immune system, and you're vulnerable to all sorts of things. And when the masking thing started, I thought back to the nurses that would administer my chemotherapy. Nobody was ever wearing a mask. And I think to myself, when did the science so radically flip that someone that had no immune system, they saw no benefit in masking around me, but today there's supposedly all these benefits of masking. Is that true?
No, it's. I mean, surgeons have worn masks for a while, and the reason the surgeons do is, droplets from coughing and sneezing onto people, and you get bacteria in those droplets, which are very large. And bacteria are much larger than viruses, and you can trap them. Even with surgeons, it's not really clear the masks work. They've been using them for a while, but there have been at least one or two controlled studies where they really didn't find any benefit from it. So it's not clear that they even work for that specific purpose. But the idea that you stop respiratory viruses, with it is, that are airborne, there simply isn't evidence that works. I mean, people would, there were some experiments with laboratories where, that if you did this, that it seemed to work in the lab. But these are very artificial situations, and the gold standard in medical research is the randomized clinical trial, and there were a bunch of these before COVID that were done, and this was why the CDC and the UK and all these other countries, when they drew up plans for a pandemic, they looked at those trials and said, there's no evidence that masking the public helps. I mean, one can come up with theoretical reasons why a mask might, reduce the viral load or do things like that. But there's so many downsides to masks that, they also trap, pathogens on the inside. So you're breathing that. You're breathing in more carbon dioxide, which is not healthy. There are lots of harms. There are obvious harms, and there's a whole constellation of symptoms of fatigue, reduced cognitive ability, headaches, things that's called mask-induced exhaustion syndrome. And this was all known before COVID. And this is why, the experts who had drawn up the pandemic plan said, no, there are a lot of downsides to masks. Obviously, it's hard for social interactions. It's hard for, for people with various disabilities if they can't see people's faces. It's terrible for children who are trying to figure out, to learn to read, to learn how to get along with other people. There are all these downsides, and we don't have the evidence that the masks work. And then during COVID, there were, one of the shameful things about the CDC and the NIH here in the United States is they issued all these edicts that completely upended society. They basically conducted an enormous experiment on the entire population, forcing people to do these things. And they didn't even bother to really track the results. I mean, at least they could have paid attention. And so the best evidence, the best research into masks actually came from other countries where they did do randomized clinical trials. And the evidence, was that they did, there was no evidence that the mask made a significant difference. At City Journal, I've published a few times now, this great graph that a data analyst did, and it tracked throughout the pandemic. Every week of the pandemic, they looked at the infection rates in every state, and they just classified them by a state that had a mask mandate that week and a state that didn't. And the curves throughout the pandemic just are identical. There was no difference in the death rates. The states without the mask mandates actually had slightly lower death rates. So that's not a randomized clinical trial, but it's a huge natural experiment, the mandate states versus the non-mandate, and you saw no effect at all. And, there are studies around the world, there's data like that around the world showing it. Sweden discouraged its citizens from wearing masks because they knew about the downside of them, and they had the lowest excess mortality rate in Europe. And the other Scandinavian countries did very well too, and they also mostly discouraged masks too. So and why people keep doing this, it's just, I guess the CDC simply, and the mainstream media can't admit how wrong they were. That I compared them in this piece in City Journal to, villagers in Thailand and Cambodia who would have these magic scarecrows that they would put outside their huts to ward off the coronavirus. And it's really, except the villagers, I think it's not quite fair to compare the maskaholics to the villagers, because at least the villagers' scarecrows didn't hurt anyone else, whereas the mask had all these downsides.
So originally, I thought that it was kind of politicians and bureaucrats having to do something in the face of a crisis, having sort of whipped people up, and it's better to do more, even if it makes no difference. But I've become more cynical about it. We all noticed when Fauci switched from almost mocking mask wearing and explaining a lot of the things you just said, to insisting. I think he's still insisting to this day, even when CNN calls him out for some of the data. And I'm reminded of a story. I don't know if you know the economist Michael Munger. And Michael, he has done a lot of he's an economist, and he's done a lot of research on the oftentimes irrational and anti-environmental outcomes when it comes to recycling. And he wrote this article a couple years ago, right before the pandemic, where he was giving a keynote talk at a gathering in Australia of all of the interest groups, the recycling industrial complex, that were working to encourage recycling and probably making a healthy profit doing it. And he was wondering why he had been invited to this, because he was going to give a talk explaining why, particularly when it comes to glass, your stated environmental goals are completely undermined by recycling. And he tells this story about after the talk, like he was surprised that more people didn't attack him during the talk. And afterwards, during coffee, he asked several people, why didn't I get more of a negative response? And they said, oh, we understand the economics of this, but we think it's important to train people how to submit to these rules, and that's our goal here, and the economics don't really matter to us. So I wonder if we're being trained to submit to additional attacks on our economic freedom and civil liberties.
I agree completely. As I mentioned, Greens are already saying that our COVID response, that the great thing about it showed people are willing to give up all these liberties to follow rules, and now that's what we have to. That's the paradigm for dealing with climate change. And of course, climate. I mean, every human activity involves carbon dioxide, so there's no limit to what you can order people to do. The other thing is that green stuff like recycling, and that, I set a record for hate mail at the New York Times Magazine with my article "Recycling is Garbage" back in the 90s. But these green edicts, they often involve making people sacrifice, and I think some of that is, as you say, that it's training people to follow our rules. It appeals to authoritarians. It appeals to people. It creates jobs and power for politicians. And that's part of it. But there's also this sense that if something is painful to do, it must be worthwhile. That we must be accomplishing something. And that's one of the problems now with getting people to take off the masks, is that they wore this around for a year or two. They made all these sacrifices. They couldn't see their friends or children. And it's really painful to admit, it's cognitive dissonance to admit that was all a waste. So I did a piece for City Journal about that. Won't get fooled again, trying to argue that we should have learned from this. But the problem, as I pointed out, is that the wearing the masks and washing your hands, singing "Happy Birthday," 6 feet apart, scrubbing down the sanitizing all the surfaces, which was completely worthless. All those things, all those sacrifices, they were basically the equivalent of a hazing ritual in a fraternity. There's interesting research into some of the earliest work in cognitive dissonance was finding that people who went through a hazing ritual, they valued the reward for that hazing ritual much more, even though the reward was worthless. they thought that it was worth something because they'd gone through this and didn't want to have to admit to themselves, gee, that was pretty stupid of me to do that. So once you've made these sacrifices, then you tend to think the reward is worth more. And you also feel, I mean, this is how why fraternities have hazing rituals. You're part of this group that went through it together. And so, masks have become the MAGA hat for progressives and for Democrats now. You wear the mask to show you're part of the group. We're all in this together. We've all made these sacrifices, and we all stand together.
The corrosive nature of it is frustrating to me as a libertarian. That is very much live and let live on everything, as long as you don't hurt me or take my stuff. But I see someone on a mask on a plane now, and I'm completely convinced that person would love to use the power of the state to make me do it too. And I just don't like that person as much. I don't know them. I'll never talk to them, but I'm like, I don't trust that guy.
I agree completely. I mean, some of them may just be sort of loyal sheep who will just follow anyone's rules and don't really want to take, but they would vote for someone who would take away your freedom. And there were really frightening polls during the pandemic, especially in the UK, where a huge number of people wanted the mask mandates to become permanent, during flu season. They wanted, these restrictions to continue. That, I mean, there are a lot of people who do like following rules, and there are, a lot of very adept politicians and bureaucrats and activists who want power badly and will get it. And I feel, I mean, when I see someone with a mask now, I share your feeling that I'm kind of appalled at them, and at the same time I feel kind of sorry that they've just been misled so badly into doing something, to looking so stupid, to making the sacrifice that, I mean, there's also this thing that that in Japan, where in Asia they've been wearing masks more during flu season for a while, and again, there's no evidence that it really that it does anything. In fact, in one of my mask articles, someone pointed out that a downside of masks is that you breathe in more carbon dioxide, and they noted that mask wearers, especially if you're wearing an N95 mask, if you wear it for a while, you're really breathing in toxic levels of carbon dioxide. By toxic meaning levels that are associated with bad effects on the body. And one of the big effects that has worried people has been about high carbon dioxide levels on pregnant women. And when the Navy started having female crews, this problem worried them so much, and they did research and they set a maximum level of carbon dioxide on the submarines. And as these researchers pointed out, those levels are exceeded by people wearing masks. So, basically telling everyone you have to wear a mask, including pregnant women, and these researchers noted that there was a higher level of stillbirths worldwide during the pandemic, not in Sweden where people didn't wear masks, but it was in the United States, and it was especially high in Asia and places where people really were wearing a lot of masks. So that's I mean, I almost want to tell people you're hurting yourself wearing that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I don't know if part of me is just wanted to say, what do you think you're accomplishing? But it's a religion for these people now. It's a sign of virtue. So it's the one thing I've learned in my whole career of debunking is it's very hard to dissuade people from their religious beliefs.
Yeah, and it's also the sort of like societal hypochondria now. Like I am conflicted. I get angry, but then I feel sorry for them because living your entire life in mortal fear that you might get sick is no way to live life.
No, and certainly that, God, from I mean, part of the problem also, I think, is related to the misogyny myth. I don't get into this in that piece, but it's something that is just the feminization of society that with women in so many positions of authority and women voters dominating the Democratic Party, women are much more risk averse than men. And And so there's this, less thing, well, we have to take some risks in life in order to get anything done. And women are much more, let's not do that, let's not go there. And the more influence they have, the way they really dominate the Democratic Party, that just leads to this, risk aversion that we can't let anyone get sick. We can't, if one person is suffering. I mean, didn't Andrew Cuomo say, if the lockdown saved just one life, it
Yeah.
will have been worth it? I mean, that's just an idiotic thing to say. I mean, in reality, I've written about this in City Journal. There were, I think, during the first year or two of the lockdowns, there were 170,000 excess deaths. That's deaths more than normal from non-COVID causes. Drug overdoses. Traffic accidents, depression, that all these things, and you disrupt the whole, everyone's life in the country, and of course you're going to have bad effects from it, and that led to some deaths, and there's really no evidence that the lockdown saved anyone. So, that's a cost-benefit analysis you do, but if you go on this, oh my God, if it saves one person, I'll wear a mask if it helps, save grandma from this, and it's just not a way to do public policy.
Yeah. Well, you've chosen a difficult task to get people to think about cost benefits and to consider scientific data, but I appreciate you doing that. Where can people find your work, and where are you on social media?
With at JohnTierneyNYC.com, I have a website, but the main place I'm at now is at City Journal. I've got a cityjournal.org, and I've got an author's page that's got it. And City Journal, I have to say, has really been doing some of the best work during the pandemic and the whole woke and all the woke topics. So it's been, I highly recommend it.
Okay.
And I recommend your show, of course. It's been great talking.
Well, hopefully the people watching this recommend my show too. So we'll see the comments. Maybe I took them just a little bit too far by having you on. We'll see how that goes.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Matt.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.